The city slept. The forecast had called for rain. By 3 in the morning, the barometer had fallen nearly an inch in 2 hours. No one was watching. The wind had begun to turn. No sirens sounded. No evacuation was given. By dawn, the streets would be unrecognizable. The city went asleep under a sky that offered no warning. It was a Tuesday night in early autumn, the kind of evening when the air hung still and heavy after sunset. Street lamps glowed over empty intersections. The Weather Service had issued a routine bulletin that afternoon: showers expected overnight, clearing by morning. There was no mention of flooding, no mention of wind. Residents closed their windows, set their alarms, and turned off the lights. In the harbor, a few commercial vessels sat anchored, their running lights barely visible through the thickening haze. Along the river, the tide was high but not unusually so. The city's drainage systems, built decades earlier to handle moderate rain, sat idle beneath the pavement. In the weather office downtown, the evening shift had ended at 11. The overnight crew would monitor conditions remotely, by telephone if necessary. The barograph in the observation room traced a steady line across paper. Pressure was normal. Temperature was mild. Wind speed was negligible. There was no reason to believe the night would be anything other than ordinary. Across the residential districts, families slept in brick row houses and wood frame apartments. The streets were quiet. The only movement came from the occasional taxi or late-shift worker heading home. Above the city, the cloud deck was low and featureless, a gray ceiling that pressed down without drama. It was the kind of night that passes unnoticed, the kind that leaves no memory. But in the atmosphere, far beyond the reach of surface observation, something had begun to shift. Shortly after midnight, the wind changed direction. It was subtle at first, a shift from southwest to southeast, the kind of adjustment that might have gone unnoticed even by those still awake. But within an hour, the change had become more pronounced. The breeze that had been barely perceptible now carried a damp chill, pushing in from the coast with increasing persistence. The barometer began to fall. In the weather office, the barograph's pen traced a slow, steady descent across the rotating drum. By 1:30 in the morning, the pressure had dropped 1/4 of an inch. By 2:15, it had dropped another quarter. The rate of descent was accelerating. There was no mechanism in place to alert anyone. The overnight observer stationed miles away would not check the instrument until morning. Above the city, the cloud deck began to thicken. What had been a flat, unmoving layer now churned with internal motion. Moisture was being drawn upward, condensing rapidly as it rose into colder air aloft. The temperature at the surface remained steady, but 5,000 feet up, the air was cooling sharply. The difference created instability. Updrafts formed, downdrafts followed. The wind at street level began to gust. At 2:45, the first rain arrived. It was light at first, a sprinkling that darkened the pavement but pooled in nothing. Within minutes, it had intensified into a steady patter. Within 10 minutes, it had become a downpour. The wind now gusted to 30 miles per hour, then 40. Windows rattled, trees swayed. A few residents stirred in their beds, half aware of the noise outside but not alarmed. Rain was expected. Wind was not uncommon. There was no reason to get up. The pressure continued to fall. By 3 in the morning, it had dropped nearly an inch from its evening reading. The storm, which had not existed 6 hours earlier, was now fully formed and directly overhead. And the city, unaware, slept on. The rain fell harder. What had been a downpour became a deluge, a continuous sheet of water that overwhelmed the city's ability to absorb it. The sewers, designed for moderate rainfall, began to fill. Storm drains gurgled and then choked. Water pooled at intersections, crept across sidewalks, and began to spread into the streets. In the low-lying districts near the river, the water rose quickly. Basements filled silently in the dark. No alarms sounded. No pumps activated. The drainage system, built on gravity alone, could not keep pace. The water had nowhere to go. It backed up through the grates, spilled over curbs, and began to flow downhill, gathering speed and volume as it went. The wind continued to gust, now reaching 50 miles per hour in exposed areas. Tree limbs snapped. Loose shingles tore free and clattered across rooftops. Power lines swayed violently, some snapping under the strain. In scattered neighborhoods, the lights went out. The outages were isolated at first, a block here, a block there. But as the wind intensified and the rain continued, the failures multiplied. By 4 in the morning, entire sections of the city were without power. The streetlights went dark. The traffic signals went dead. The pumps that might have cleared the flooded intersections ceased to function. The river, swollen by the rain and pushed by the wind, began to overtop its banks. The levees, earthen and aging, held for a time, but the water found weaknesses. It seeped through. It eroded. It pooled on the inland side and began to spread. In the harbor, the storm surge pushed water inland, flooding the wharves and low-lying warehouses. Ships strained against their moorings. The tide, which should have receded, remained high, trapped by the wind and the pressure. The rain showed no sign of slowing. The wind showed no sign of easing, and still the city slept. A few residents woke to the sound of water in their homes, to the sight of dark streets through rain-streaked windows. Some called the police, some called neighbors. The phone lines, overloaded, crackled with static or went silent. There was no coordinated response. There was no warning system. There was only the storm and the rising water and the darkness. The first reports reached the police station just before 5 in the morning. A patrolman making his rounds found a street impassable, submerged under 3 feet of water. He radioed in. The dispatcher, unsure of what to do, called another precinct. The line was busy. Another call came in from a different neighborhood reporting flooding and downed power lines. Then another. Then a dozen more. By 5:30, the phones were ringing continuously. The scope of the situation was becoming clear, but there was no way to respond. The fire department had no boats. The utility crews could not reach the down lines. The streets in many areas were no longer streets. They were rivers. In the residential districts, families woke to find water seeping under doors, rising through floorboards, filling rooms. Some climbed to upper floors. Some tried to leave, only to find their cars submerged, their streets impassable. A few ventured out on foot, wading through waist-deep water in the pre-dawn darkness, searching for higher ground. The wind had not relented. It howled through the city, tearing at anything loose, anything exposed. The rain continued, unceasing, adding inches of water to streets that could hold no more. Entire neighborhoods were cut off. Bridges were submerged. Railroads were underwater. The trolley lines, electrified, were dead and dangerous. There was no way in and no way out. The mayor, woken by an aide, made his way to City Hall through streets that were barely navigable. The scope of the disaster was still unclear. Reports were fragmentary, contradictory. Some areas seemed fine, others were completely inundated. There was no centralized information. There were no maps showing the extent of the flooding. There was only chaos and confusion and the relentless sound of rain. By 6 in the morning, the storm had begun to weaken. The wind dropped to 40 miles per hour, then 30. The rain, still heavy, no longer fell with the same intensity, but the damage was done. The water remained. The power remained out. And as the sun began to rise, hidden behind the clouds, the city began to see what the night had brought. The storm had been born of pressure. At its core, the event was driven by a rapid and localized drop in atmospheric pressure, a collapse that occurred with unusual speed during the hours after midnight. Under normal conditions, such a drop would have been detected by the network of weather stations that ringed the region, providing hours of advance warning. But this storm had formed too quickly and too close for the instruments of the era to provide adequate notice. The evening observations had shown nothing unusual. By the time the next scheduled reading was taken, the storm was already overhead. The mechanism was straightforward but catastrophic in its effect. A disturbance in the upper atmosphere, likely triggered by the collision of a cold front moving south with warm, moist air lingering over the coast, created a zone of rapid vertical motion. Air rose quickly, cooled, condensed, and released enormous quantities of latent heat. This heat fueled further rising motion, intensifying the system in a feedback loop. The pressure at the surface dropped sharply. Winds, drawn inward by the pressure gradient, accelerated rapidly. The storm, which had not existed at sunset, reached its peak intensity in less than 4 hours. The timing amplified the disaster. Nocturnal storms are inherently more dangerous. There is no visual warning. There are no shadows on the horizon, no darkening skies to signal approach. The city slept through the critical hours when action might have been taken. When the wind arrived, it arrived in darkness. When the water rose, it rose unseen. By the time people woke, it was too late to evacuate, too late to prepare. The urban environment itself made the flooding worse. Paved streets and packed soil prevented absorption. Water that might have soaked into fields or forests instead ran across impervious surfaces, gathering speed and volume. The drainage system, built for rainfall measured in inches per day, was overwhelmed by rainfall measured in inches per hour. The river, confined by levees, had no room to spread. The surge, pushed by wind and held in place by pressure, could not dissipate. Every element of the city's design, intended to manage water under normal conditions, became a liability under extreme ones. The storm left the city before noon. The wind died, the rain stopped. The clouds broke apart, revealing a sky that was clear and indifferent, but the water remained. It would take days to recede, weeks to pump out, months to repair the damage. The final counts would show hundreds of homes destroyed, thousands more damaged. Infrastructure had failed at every level: power, communication, transportation, sanitation. The cost would run into the tens of millions, an unthinkable sum for the era. But the deeper question was not what had happened, but why. The storm itself had not been extraordinary. Stronger storms had come before. Stronger storms would come again. What made this event catastrophic was the timing, the speed, and the city's complete lack of preparation. Nighttime storms are invisible. They offer no chance for observation, no opportunity for response. The transition from ordinary rain to disaster occurred in less than 3 hours, too fast for manual systems to react, too fast for human judgment to intervene. The city had been built on the assumption that weather could be managed, that floods could be controlled, that infrastructure could withstand whatever nature delivered. The storm shattered that assumption. It revealed that cities, for all their engineering and planning, remain fundamentally vulnerable to the atmosphere. That a shift in pressure, a change in wind, a surge of rain in the dark can undo in hours what took decades to build. In the years that followed, changes were made. Weather observation became more frequent. Forecasting became more sophisticated. Drainage systems were expanded. Levees were reinforced. But the vulnerability remained. No system could account for every scenario. No forecast could predict every storm. And no city, no matter how prepared, could ever be entirely safe from a night like that one. The storm that broke the city at night was not the strongest. It was simply the one that arrived when no one was watching.